In this video, we're going to learn how to create input fields. And the way you would create input fields is as simple as creating checkboxes and radio buttons. So we create an input tag, and this time for the type attribute, we just write text and it automatically creates a input field. And for creating a password field, we just write password for the type attribute. And you guys can see we have a label tag as well. A label is not a self-closing tag, so you have to close the label tag at the end. So you can also label your input fields by just writing label and then writing password. And you see that we have a for attribute here, and then it's named security and the ID is security. You can name it whatever you want. It doesn't necessarily need to be security or whatever you want. The reason we just give a for attribute is when you click on the label, if the for attribute and the ID attribute matches, it would direct you to the exact input field. So that's the only reason we use a for attribute when it comes to labels. Alright, let's jump into the action. So you guys can go ahead and open the HTML input folder. Now let's open the HTML index as well. So we're going to create a heading, call it input type. And then for this one, we want to have an input again. And this time we want to leave the type as text. And as soon as I press save, we can see that we created an input field, and we can just write anything we want, and then we have a submit button usually. And now let's go ahead and create a password input field. So we just give it a heading called password, and then we just give it an input, and this time we want it to be password. So when we save it, let's check the result. For example, you write username whatever, and then for the password you see that it's being hashed, and the reason is you just created an input field with a type password. And let's see if we create a label. So if we write label and then write my user and then call it username, and then we just write input type text, and as we saw, we just gonna give it an ID, call it my user. Okay, I'm just gonna give it a little bit of style. We will get to the HTML styles later, but I'm just gonna give the label margin top 50 pixel. This is just for demonstration. I just want to show you guys what does the label do, and then also give it a margin button. Oops, margin. If I can write it properly, 20 pixels. So you see that when we click on the input password or input type, it's not being redirected, but when we have a label, when we click on it, now we can start writing, for example, username. And this is the difference between labels and heading. So if you give it like a for attribute, so if we remove the for attribute and when we click on it, nothing works. But if we have the for attribute that matches the ID attribute, so when you click on it, it just it lets you write your username and it directs you to the input field. So that's the other thing when it comes to labels. So I'm just going to delete that and delete. We'll get to this style tag later, and then this is CSS. We'll get to that later as well. But yeah, I just wanted to show you guys how you can create like username input and then password. So this is how you would create input fields and password fields.